After securing a well-received 2024 draft class, the New Orleans Saints add to it a top 10 undrafted free agency class as well. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I'm your host, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're taking a look at the team's undrafted free agency class, including a UDFA that hasn't gotten talked about a lot, but is already starting to catch some eyes and bring some intrigue. We're going to dive into Colorado State tight end Dallin Holker and why there's so much excitement around him and his potential role with the New Orleans Saints. We're going to lead everything off here with the rankings from our good friend Thor Nystrom from over at FantasyPros, who ranked the New Orleans Saints with a top 10 undrafted free agency class. We're going to get into what made up those rankings, why he liked it so much, and of course, what it all means for the New Orleans Saints. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen of the day every day, and for being an everydayer here on the Locked On Saints podcast, which is a proud part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers will get $150 in bonus bets simply by winning any $5 money line bet. That's all it takes. That's $150 with winning any $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So as we take a look, the New Orleans Saints right now considered to have we saw A pluses, A's, all that when it came to the draft rankings for the New Orleans Saints 2024 draft class, but it's their undrafted free agency class that's drawing a lot of praise now as well. Thor Nystrom every single year does one of my favorite pieces over at FantasyPros now, where he breaks down all of the undrafted free agency classes, breaks them all down by guys that were selected by a team or signed by a team that land within his top 500 prospects. So twice the draft, basically. And whoever ends up with kind of the most of those prospects ends up kind of moving up the board and everything like that. But there's value here, how many of them are draftable versus not, all these other things. And so the Saints end up with two players that on Thor's board were draftable, and then end up with an additional 5 players of their 15-player undrafted free agency class that are in the top 500 of his board. Now, to be fair, in one instance, Malik Langham, who is a defensive tackle out of Purdue, 6'4", 302 pounds. He's a guy that's not actually a signee for the New Orleans Saints, but is coming in on a tryout. Like, he's gotten the invite to participate in Saints minicamp this weekend. So we'll see if he's able to stick around after that. But outside of that, everybody else is players that the Saints have signed as undrafted free agents. And at the very top of the list, the two drafted players, Dallin Holker and Yahoo Tipton. We're going to be talking about a lot on today's show. I kind of want to highlight those two in our next couple of segments. But when we look at a team like the New Orleans Saints, who have been so successful in undrafted free agency, even recently with Carl Granderson and Deontay Hardy and Rashid Shaheed, so on and so forth. But then you can also dig further back into the annals of history if you want to. You've got Lance Moore, you've got Pierre Thomas, you have all these other players that the Saints have been able to bring in as undrafted free agents that have been great for them. And they really give these guys an opportunity to show what it is that they can do. The other 5 players, which includes Malik Langham, who again isn't actually signed, but is coming for is going to be participating in rookie minicamps. The other 4 players that rank within Thor's top 500. Trajan Jeffcoat, the defensive lineman out of Arkansas, just barely outside of the draftable player range at pick 285. Technically, I guess that would make him draftable. The draft is 257 players. You imagine some number of players outside of those rankings could potentially end up drafted. So with Malik Langham coming in at 271 and Trajan Jeffcoat coming in at 285, you could consider those guys just on like the cusp of draftable. Dallin Holker coming out of Colorado State was 156 and Yahoo Tipton 251. So both of them within that 257 ranking. Saints also brought in TCU safety Millard Bradford, who hits 384. Kyler Baugh out of Minnesota, somebody I would definitely be keeping an eye out on just because of the Saints severe need now on their interior offensive line. 418 was his ranking. And then Isaiah Stalbird, the hybrid linebacker slash safety who's going to be playing linebacker when he starts here in New Orleans out of South Dakota State University, he comes in ranked at number 434. So here we go again. The New Orleans Saints finding their way into a really good crop of undrafted free agent players. Now they rank in the top 10, they rank at number 9, so they're just ahead of the Jacksonville Jaguars, for instance, who are at 10. Ahead of them are teams that include the Carolina Panthers at 8. I'm just going to look at teams that are of note. The Denver Broncos at 5, no surprise there. Seattle Seahawks at 4, typically always very good in this range. And then the number 1 team were the Kansas City Chiefs, who just had like a ton of different undrafted players that rank within the top 500 of Thor's rankings, which makes sense, right? Your undrafted free agents that would go somewhere and win a Super Bowl are probably going to go to the team that's on the verge of a three-peat to get their ranking. But why is this important for the New Orleans Saints? The reason why I wanted to highlight this is because there's a lot different about this New Orleans Saints team. They overhauled their coaching staff. You're seeing the Saints shedding off some of the players from the previous regime, from the Sean Payton days, all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that has remained the same is effectively their offseason process. They're still restructuring contracts. They're still making money moves and all those other things. That's a throwback for you. They're still, drafting well, although this year they drafted a lot more patiently than they typically have. They didn't leverage next year's draft capital in order to be able to move around this year. So maybe there's a little bit of a changing of the guard there. But you saw the Saints trust their board, not, mess around, like all other stuff. Like, look, they've made some selections that didn't work out in the past. Marcus Davenport obviously is the one that's going to headline that conversation in terms of the Rolodex of players. It's probably running through your head right now as first round picks, but did they trust their board? Yes, just sometimes the board doesn't work. So we'll see if the board ends up working this time. But then the other piece that you can see here, the Saints are still doing extremely well, is bringing in undrafted free agents and giving players an opportunity. Almost every undrafted free agent that comes through New Orleans is aware of the success rate of undrafted free agents in New Orleans and the opportunities that they're given, the way that they're looked at, all these other things, the way that they're developed, the way that they're treated, right? Like one of the things that Sean Payton used to say all the time that I'm sure that this New Orleans Saints team still says, particularly in the front office, is it doesn't matter if you were drafted in the first round, third round, seventh round, or an undrafted free agent, or maybe you got here as a veteran free agent, or you got here through a trade or whatever. It doesn't matter. Everybody gets a fair shake, right? Like all that stuff about how you got to the facility kind of fades away once you get to the facility, and then everybody gets a fair shake after that. So it's clear why this is still a big deal for the New Orleans Saints. This can be one of the biggest opportunities for them to continue to build out their roster and build out depth with effective talent if they're able to cultivate, nurture, and develop that talent. So we'll see what this new coaching staff is able to do when it comes down to that. So that explains how they got the top 10 ranking, why it's important, and the players that end up falling within that top 500 gives you a pretty good indication of the players that could potentially end up challenged to making the roster here in 2024. And of course, the one that highlights that conversation every single time that I bring it up, or I talk to somebody on the street, or I talk to somebody on their show or whatever, the one guy that always seems to come up is Colorado State tight end Dallin Holker. And it's for good reason, because his path to the New Orleans Saints roster is unique, and therefore the opportunity is absolutely there for him. Let's break that down a little bit more as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. FanDuel is our official sports betting partner here on the Locked On Podcast Network. You got rookie props that you can go and check out for offensive rookie of the year, defensive rookie of the year. There's even over-unders for like Jaden Daniels passing yards and stuff like that. There's a ton to go and check out. And of course, it's winner take all time in the NBA and in the NHL. So FanDuel is giving you the opportunity to bring home a big win for yourself as well, because right now, new customers are going to get $150 in bonus bets by simply winning a $5 bet. So for instance, tonight in the NBA, the New York Knicks are favored by 5 points or more up against the Indiana Pacers. So it's a pretty good favorite there. If you like them, go and put $5 down as a first-time customer. And if you win that bet, you get the little bit of winnings from that, but then you also get $150 in bonus bets that you can then use on spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started and get in on the action. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, family. Colorado State tight end Dallin Holker has been the talk of the UDFA class, and for good reason, because he really does have an opportunity to make this roster at a position where the New Orleans Saints definitely need some help. We appreciate you very much as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 stream as well. The first of its kind on YouTube is a national sports 24/7 stream. All the biggest stories around the league covered by the people that know the teams the best, that cover them every single day, just like we do for the New Orleans Saints here on Locked On Saints. So go and check them out over on YouTube. Just search Locked On Sports Today. You can also find it on the free Amazon TV channels app as well. So Dallin Holker is a guy that at this point, I think everybody has kind of picked as their favorite to earn a roster spot with the New Orleans Saints here in 2024. So let's break down kind of why that thought has been so pervasive across. And I'm going to borrow a little bit, just taking a look at, the Fantasy Pros piece here to give you a little bit of insight from the way that Thor has looked at it as well. And I'll probably try to get Thor on the show. I don't want to do many guests, but Thor was like one of my first ever Locked On Saints guests, where we broke down. He does a cumulative kind of a cumulative ranking as well of draft classes plus UDFA classes. And I think a couple years ago, the Saints ranked pretty highly on that list. And so we ended up talking to him. So I think we'll do that again, if he'll be kind enough to join the show again. But Thor's a good dude. So one of the things that you look at when it comes to Dallin Holker is, okay, so where does he play? The 6'3", 230, 240 pound tight end. Typically, that's undersized for a tight end, but you look at some of the guys that the Saints have on their roster right now, and that are playing at the position, 6'2", basically, for Taysom Hill, who plays a particular role that's pretty similar to what Dallin Holker is going to bring to the table. We'll kind of highlight that here in a little bit. Foster Morrow's 6'4", all that. So, I would look at that as just a general thing to kind of look at, well, the Saints have really dropped their prototype for tight end. You look at Jared Cook. Sorry to bring that up. You look at Benjamin Watson was kind of on the ring there, or on the edge there. But then you look at Jimmy Graham, of course. You look at Colby Fleener, of course. These guys were kind of bigger, taller, bulkier, sturdier guys. Michael Ho'omanawanui, which is a name I haven't gotten to say in a long time. And so I took my opportunity to say Michael Ho'omanawanui twice. Why not? But really, he was another one of those guys, right? That was big, stocky, all those types of things. So the Saints have kind of clearly shifted their prototype at tight end here over the last little bit. They're kind of going for the more athletic guys. And that's exactly where Dallin Holker fits in. One of the things that Thor observes here is that while he doesn't have the speed, he's got really, really good agility. He has shown what he can do kind of in the short area quickness stuff. 94th percentile in the 3-cone, 83rd percentile in the short shuttle. So really, really, dominating in those areas. And you can kind of see, as he mentions, the change of direction fluidness is evident after the catch. So you think about him as a little bit of a yards after catch threat. And I think you certainly saw that if you watched any Colorado State Rams games over the course of the last little bit, or you just are a draft junkie and you really liked, Dallin Holker for, really wanted to look into it, and then you found Dallin Holker. I think you certainly saw that there. And I think that that's the right way to look at him. He's not the fastest guy in the world, 4.78, but he does some things that you probably don't expect a guy that runs a 4.78 to do. And one of the other things that I really enjoy that Thor highlighted was his arm length, longest arms of any of his top 15 tight ends. That includes actually being tied with the 6'7", 260 pound Minnesota tight end, Brevin Spann-Ford. So you have a guy who's 6'3" with arms just as long as a 6'7" guy. That's going to increase your catch radius as a 6'3" guy. He comes in with 33 and what I would call 3/4 inch arms, 33.625. That's 625 out of 8. So we'll call it lightly 33 and 3/4 of an inch. those are long arms. Like those arms are longer than first round pick Taliesin Fuanga, who comes in at 33 and a quarter, if I remember correctly. And so, pretty good arm length there, and big old hands too at 10 and a quarter inch. So I think that that's the other thing that you look at is his ability to be able to kind of help you as a pass catcher, as a hands catcher, because he can get outside of his frame. He can make some uncomfortable catches. He expands your catch radius, all those other things. And I think that's something that you want. Like when you're going to operate in a quick pass offense, sometimes that means, particularly early on as you're starting to shift there, not every pass is going to be perfectly on the numbers. And let's just face it, it's the NFL. Not every pass can be perfectly on the numbers. Sometimes if I'm a quarterback and I want to save your life, I'm not throwing it at the numbers. I'm not throwing it in front of you. I'm throwing it down. I'm throwing it low and behind you because I want you to stop and not get hit by that linebacker over the middle of the field, so on and so forth, right? So there's a lot of different examples of how that could potentially end up impacting Dallin Holker positively. But I think the biggest thing is that if he can go out there and simply catch passes, he can make the roster. Like that's kind of all that he's got to do. And then the other piece that makes him so unique is the deployment. So you hear the uniqueness in the numbers, but then the uniqueness in the role is interesting too. I think I said in my Bleacher Report team stream yesterday that to me, Dallin Holker can give you everything that Taysom Hill gives you. Let me not say it that way because that's not entirely true. But Dallin Holker has the potential to help you in the same areas as Taysom Hill, sans throwing the football. Although I asked Dallin Holker about that, he said that he would rate his arm a 6 out of 10 and could definitely throw the football if the Saints wanted him to, which is fun, but obviously the Saints will never ask him to do that. Or maybe they will. I don't know. They probably won't though. So him being able to line up out of the backfield as an H-back, him being able to line up in the slot, in line, out wide, just move around in a bunch of different places. I think those are the things that you look at that kind of go, okay, yeah, there's a unique aspect that will allow him to be able to make it there. Now, here's the thing. Do the Saints put him on the practice squad or do they immediately put him on the active roster? And I know everybody's going to say the same thing that everybody says every single year, which is, oh, but if the Saints cut him, then some other team's definitely going to poach him. We say this every year. Every single year, Shaq Davis, Emmanuel Butler, yada, yada, so on and so forth. He'll clear waivers probably. Like more than likely he would. Like so many teams are way more focused on keeping and bringing back the guys that they moved on from than they are about whatever else is going on anywhere else. Because I just invested, if I'm an NFL general manager and a team and coaching staff, I just invested 3 weeks, 4 weeks of NFL training camps plus preseason games and all this stuff in these prospects. I'm not worried about going to go and grab a guy from another team unless they're a veteran that I already know is going to work in the NFL and that I've seen work in my scheme before, but I'm not going to go out there and try to grab some other team's undrafted free agents. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the guys that know my system. I want to keep them around, right? The ones that I looked at, the ones that I've invested time in, the ones that have invested in the organization. That's what I'm more concerned about, 32 teams wise. And so the Saints could probably get him to the practice squad unless he has some enormous 300 yard total, like preseason, right? 3 games, 100 yards per game. You get what I'm saying, right? Unless he has some type of like ridiculous thing. But in that case, you're not trying to get in the practice squad anywhere. You're saying, okay, that's our new starting tight end in that case. You know what I mean? And so it's just a different level of requirement at that point. So I do think that Dallin Holker and the hype that's around him is, generally speaking, warranted. I'm not going to go so far as to say he's going to be your next starting tight end or that he's going to be, the next this, that, and the other. He often gets compared to like Kyle Juszczyk and his usage over in San Francisco, or Taysom Hill and his usage here in New Orleans. I think the Taysom Hill comparison probably fits him a little bit more. But in any case, like there's a role here in New Orleans for him that's probably not available anywhere else. We also just watched 31 other teams, 32 total teams pass up on him when it came to the draft as well. So that's another one of those reasons that you go, okay, well, I mean, undrafted free agent, like if you can get him in the practice squad, get him in the practice squad. So I'm excited to see him, man. I think he's a really talented dude. I think he's got a real unique skill set. He's going to be a lot of fun to watch throughout training camp, and I'm super excited to see him. But I truly do think that the hype around Dallin Holker making the roster, or the potential of him making the roster, is warranted. Now let's see if he can make good on that hype. Coming up next, I want to introduce you to a player that we haven't really gotten to talk too much about, Yale's Mason Tipton, and why all of a sudden he's starting to turn heads without ever hitting the field. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends at Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on the classic Monopoly game that you know and loved. Gives you access to be able to play on a bunch of different boards in a bunch of different worlds and a bunch of stuff that you're not used to in Monopoly that helps to make it even more fun. Like when you play with friends, you can take wrecking balls to their iconic buildings, monuments, things like that. Make it a little bit tough for them. You can also check out stuff to where you're able to heist their vaults and steal all their riches for yourself. You've got collectibles like stickers that you can trade and find with friends, complete albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with, and so much more, including mini games, multipliers, all of it. Monopoly Go is a ton of fun. And I get people who ask me all the time, Ross, do you actually like Monopoly Go? And the answer that I tell them is yes. It's always something fun and new to discover when it comes to Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download Monopoly Go today for free on Google Play or the App Store. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. If you haven't heard about Yale wide receiver Mason Tipton just yet, I promise you're about to. Not just because I'm about to talk about him, but because he's a guy that a lot of folks in this UDFA class are honing in on as another player that could potentially stick around, whether that's active roster or more likely practice squad as well, but why he has what it takes to potentially stick around. We appreciate you very much, of course, for being here for another episode of Locked On Saints. Don't forget, we are your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it. And so coming up in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to take a little bit of a preview look at rookie minicamps, what to expect, what you can actually learn, what it really looks like. Like there's no offense versus defense, but what it is that we can learn or what it is that we'd like to learn. And I'm going to tell you why the New Orleans Saints, I don't feel like they've really improved their roster, but the team can still improve in 2024. I'll explain all of that in tomorrow's episode. So looking at Mason Tipton, the 5'9", 170 plus pound wide receiver out of Yale, what is it about this player that all of a sudden has so many people kind of discussing him, right? As a guy that could potentially make the roster, all of that. So look, he's a little bit undersized for his position. That's for sure. Again, 5'9", 179 pounds. Arm length of just 29.5 inches. He's not a big dude, right? We get that. But it is his athleticism that really jumps off the page. And he, of course, had a phenomenal pro day, which is part of what put him on the map for sure. Thor wrote about him in his FantasyPros piece. He was ranking the Saints undrafted free agency class, did just like one little sentence about him, mentioning that there is a reason to keep an eye on Mason Tipton. And his quote here is, a prospect with the game and athleticism to hang as a developmental project for future slot duties. Sorry, I said duties. So when I look at that and I think, okay, so where could the New Orleans Saints potentially use this guy in the future? It really is about the future. It's probably not a 2024 impact kind of thing unless you deal with, injuries at the position and stuff like that. But the Saints, who typically like their bigger slot guys, aren't afraid to at least take a look at a different mold. And so at 5'9", 179 pounds, you're probably not putting this guy on the outside, though that's what he did almost exclusively at Yale. He lined up on the left side of the field, and that was his role. He just was that guy. He ended up scoring 10 touchdowns last year in 2023 on 52 receptions and 786 receiving yards. Those 10 touchdowns led the Ivy League, and those 786 receiving yards also led the Ivy League. He also added a 15-yard rushing touchdown as well. So, look, I think that there are some things that could be a lot of fun about him. He is a dude that, has a little bit of that athleticism to be able to pick up some extra yards after catch, all that. He is also somebody that could maybe bring you a little bit of, deep field ability. Let's say that something happens and you need another deep threat type of guy, then all of a sudden that's where Mason Tipton can absolutely be a benefit from you or for you, right? He ran a 4.33. His acceleration is off the charts. He also added a 37-inch vertical jump. So his pro day was just insane. 4.33 40-yard dash, 37-inch vertical jump, like I mentioned. He also had a nice broad jump as well to show some more explosiveness at 10'5". Had a 4.22 shuttle, a 7.05 3-cone. That could have been better, that's for sure. But outside of that 3-cone, and the shuttle's kind of like above average, but not elite. everything else checks off as elite. Like he's got a lot of green on his RAS card. You know what I'm saying? All the red comes in at his size and his strength and stuff like that. But I think that's okay. But I do think that the athleticism is the big thing that kind of sets him apart, because you could see it on the tape as well. Even when he was, running routes out of that left side over at Yale, you could see them get the ball to him quickly and let him kind of do a little bit of work and go and grab some yards after catch, all that. He also has the speed to win win vertically. But the thing that I really liked about his tape was the way that he can win by crossing the field. And so we spoke weeks ago now when we talked about how the wide zone offense impacts each element of the field. We looked at the run game, the passing game. We looked at quarterback, running back, wide receivers. We got to wrap up with tight ends and O-line and stuff like that. I kind of put that series on hold because people just didn't seem to be liking it. But I'll come back to it after we get through draft season and all this other stuff where, you're going to want to know more about the system. And I'll be able to ask more questions and get more intel on what you should expect to see and stuff like that. So we'll definitely circle around back to it to discuss it. But if you did miss it, the shorthand is one of the things that ends up helping you out in the passing game in these types of offenses is taking advantage of crossing routes, right? We see this in the Shanahan style offenses all the time, tearing teams apart by crossing, players over the middle of the field, creating conflict defenders where the linebacker goes, you throw where he didn't go, or where the safety that's, playing a robber role down underneath where he goes, you throw where he didn't go, all these other things. And so a guy like Mason Tipton, who's got that 4.3 speed, running across the field, when you're effectively forcing a corner into trail technique or a safety or whatever, right, depending upon where you're deployed from, that ends up having a lot of value for you because you just leave that guy in the dust. His only choice at that point is just to chase you. And when you run with 4.33 speed, you're going to be running away from that guy. It was one of the reasons why I was so perplexed at the lack of crossing concepts, particularly conflict-creating crossing concepts. Sorry for the alliteration there. But the lack of that in last year's offense, when you have these burners in Rashid Shaheed and Chris Olave, take advantage of that. Run these guys across the field, not just down the field. Now, we saw there was a recent research piece that came out, one of those, plot graphs and all these other things that showed that like Derek Carr was the most accurate passer of quarterbacks that threw more than 25 more than 25 passes of 25 yards or more downfield. He was up there at around, I think it's 44 passes of 25 or more. And he was the most accurate or threw the most catchable passes amongst all the quarterbacks in that arena. And so you look at guys like Baker Mayfield, who are on the opposite side. He threw 44 of them, but he was like 20% in terms of delivering catchable passes and all this other stuff. So Derek Carr was really, really good in that area. So finding these players that can go down there and uncover deep is great. But you got to be able to do a little bit more too, right? These crossing routes, the over routes, the things that just stress out a defense like crazy. This is where Mason Tipton can get involved. Now, again, I don't think he gets involved in 2024 unless there are some injuries ahead of him. But as a guy that you could potentially develop for days down the road or need for a speedster at another time or whatever it might be, that's maybe a place for Mason Tipton. If you're able to develop him over time, get him on a reserve future deal, bring him back for 2025, then maybe he finds a way to contribute to you in the next couple of years. That's the way that I would see it with this player. But we'll see too. I mean, if he lights up training camp, lights up the preseason, then all of a sudden we might be talking about things a little bit differently. The Saints don't have a bona fide slot guy. They have guys that can play in the slot and that can deploy from the slot, and that's good. I think maybe now you look at Cedric Wilson maybe as that guy, but again, very different style slot receiver, Cedric Wilson, plus 6 foot, plus 200 pounds, to Mason Tipton, who is 5'9", 179, and shifty as all get out. So that's where I think that maybe he can have that impact for you. Just when he has the impact is going to come down to his development, and the Saints should take their time there. This should be a project guy, but I'm really, really excited to see what he's doing. And again, another guy to where the hype, the excitement, all those other things, the sort of guesswork around how he might be able to contribute, it's warranted. It's warranted because he's a really, really talented player, and he has these natural gifts of athleticism that you just simply can't teach. Remember, there are some boxes you got to check in order to develop at the next level. And while Mason Tipton doesn't have the size boxes, he definitely has the athleticism boxes checked without any question. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, remember, we're going to be taking a look ahead to rookie mini camps, which begin this weekend. Yes, we're already there. And we're also going to dive into why I don't believe that the Saints have necessarily improved their roster, but why that's not necessarily a bad thing either, and what the Saints are telling you by making those decisions. I still think they need to do a little bit more in free agency though, but I might be alone in that assumption, but that's just me. All right, so I appreciate you very much. As always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day for your second listen. Locked On Pelicans, Jake Madison, Locked On LSU, Caroline Fitton, got everything you need from around the state here in Locked On Louisiana. We appreciate you very much for making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Learn how the family's doing, how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.